Okay, hey everybody. How are you all doing? Going. So, let's get this going. Right. Um, Here we are. So this one is a bit of a tricky one in terms of order, in terms of thinking about how I'm angling this at you, because obviously the main focus of this now is for you to revise, obviously, for anything we're doing up at the end of the term. But we also, obviously, I'm bearing in mind that this will be useful for you later down the line. So this is hopefully going to be useful for you next year when you're coming back to revise Hamlet. And obviously for anyone else watching this, might also be for any new students joining next year as well when they want to go through Hamlet. So this is kind of going to be the case of I'm basically just going to treat this as if we're going through it for the first time again, simply because I want to keep it tonally the same as the other videos. So we're going to go from essentially from the start of Act 1, Scene 1, up until the rest of the play. I'm not going to go through the week's work or anything. I've done that earlier in the week. You should have that already. The assignment's already been out. That's been out there since Monday. You should know what's due, what's coming in. So all I've put up on the side is what we're doing this week, in this session, and that's going to be the presentation of Denmark at the start. These are going to be the key focuses. Obviously, I'll go through in more detail specific points. But the presentation of Denmark, the king's introduction and his relationship to Polonius and politics and scheming and Machiavellianism and whatever. Hamlet's soliloquy, his first soliloquy, the nature of soliloquies. I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And then Hamlet's interaction with Horatio at the end, which itself is something that we didn't really touch on much the first time through. So this is going to be hopefully a good chance to go through that. If I run out of time, obviously, I will finish off Scene 2 next week. Remember, not next week, because next week's half term. So what I'll do is that these sessions will keep running once a week on the Thursday at this time slot, and I'm going to hopefully by the end of the year, by the end of the term, catch up to the point where there are videos for every single scene of the play, which will hopefully be really useful for us all in our revision and study of Hamlet. So without much further ado, I say let's get to the play, but actually what we should do is we should get to have a quick look at the castle where we are. So here it is on the sheet that I sent through to you. Here's a nice image of Kronborg Castle in Helsingør, or as it's translated into English for Hamlet, Elsinore in its English name. So here you can see the castle itself. It very much, you can't quite see it from this angle, although you can see little bits of it here. Let's zoom in a wee bit. Yeah, you can see little hints of it here, but it's very much a Renaissance designed castle. It's got the star fortification around it like most did at the time period, and it's quite elaborately done up actually, very much not in a necessarily military style, although obviously it would serve that purpose, and it has been a castle that's taken conflict here and there over time. So yeah, actually there it is, the real place. You can go there now should you wish to. Well, not right now because you're probably still on lockdown, but it is possible to visit this place. It's a World Heritage Site. It's very, very excellent. So with that in mind, let's kind of think about obviously this specific setting. This is obviously like almost all of Shakespeare's tragedies. There's one that doesn't take place in. There's one that does take place in England. Sorry, that is King Lear. But even then, that's set in a kind of ahistorical, almost pre-historical, certainly pre-Christian England. The kind of time frame on that one is actually really kind of abstract, and it's not very clear when necessarily it's set. But King Lear's that. Obviously, you have Macbeth as well, which is set in Scotland. Just as a reminder, England and Scotland not unified in any kind of nation format for another 100-ish years after this play is set. So do be aware that obviously when you look at Macbeth, Scotland is a separate nation at this time point. But the vast majority of Shakespeare's tragedies and his plays in general, in all honesty, are set over in Italy and or Greece, the kind of classical framework. So I think along those lines, Hamlet stands out a wee bit. Denmark is a kind of unique location within Shakespeare's plays. It's the only one, I think that this is the only one that this nation turns up in. And I think really, guys, the specific reason for this choice, it's not, I don't think, necessarily because Shakespeare had a lot to say about Denmark. It wasn't like he was a huge fan of the Danish nation. It's mostly that this is where the original story of Hamlet was told and set. So prior to Shakespeare writing this play, there had been a couple of existing versions, and actually this is something that I don't really have time for in the whole video, but I'm going to kind of point it out to you now, and it's something that you can go and research. There's at least one stage version in English of Hamlet. Prior to that, it's often referred to as the Hamlet, and for those of you who want to know how to spell that, let me just quickly think about chalking it up. Actually, let's put it on. Yeah, I'll put it up on there here in a second. But the Hamlet is the kind of like progenitor to Hamlet. It's like this was the original Hamlet kind of text, and that itself, obviously, like many of these plays, there we go. Let's see if I put that up on there. Let's shrink that down a bit. Like many of these plays, guys, at the time, the play itself, that one, Hamlet, was based on a pre-existing story from a translated tale, like many of Shakespeare's texts were. So it was a pre-existing prose story. Now, in that original story, the story is much more developed. We still have all of the kind of uncle murdering, revenge on uncle kingship, but then it goes further beyond that, and Hamlet goes off to Scotland and marries a princess and has all kinds of other adventures before he ends up resolving his narrative. So what I'm trying to remind you of is, like all Shakespeare's plays, pretty much, it has a source material, it has a basis, and even the play itself that we look at, the Hamlet from Shakespeare, there are 3 distinct versions as a reminder. So there is the 2-quarto versions, and there's the folio version. The one that we look at in class, the Arden Shakespeare edition, takes a kind of mix match of some of those ones. Okay, so hopefully that's quite a good place to start then, thinking about this kind of existing background to the play. Now, something that I'm going to talk about quite a lot today is the idea that the opening of the play establishes this very much uncertain and ambiguous world, and I think this sentence here I'm going to read, this is from Hamlet's Denmark by Lillian Shanfield, is, I'm going to read this sentence here. I'm just going to read the first paragraph because it's actually really useful. Even when Shakespeare's plays are set in real places like Vienna, Venice, Cyprus or Windsor, we know that they were not intended to be actual representations of those cities or societies. We also realise that they often disguise aspects of Elizabethan England or depict composite societies, including those that are purely imaginative with absolutely no pretence to reality. Like Illyria, Arden, or unnamed islands. Still, after settling into a willing suspension of disbelief, the Shakespeare audience approaches the stage culture as if to say that is, this society did exist. The character types, the values, concerns, worldviews, and so forth would emanate logically from that culture. In a dramatic sense, if not a real one, it can be regarded as a coherent culture. Such coherence has, in my opinion, eluded Shakespeare's most popular play, Hamlet, because in full text anyway, the play presents its audience with a daunting, if not incompatible, mix of cultural elements. So we've got Elizabethan, Danish, medieval, Renaissance, Catholic, Protestant, political, kinship, courtly, linguistic, literary, gender, philosophical, legal, and psychoanalytic. In short, it presents us with an incoherent culture. This has contributed to the enigmatic nature of the play, which has perhaps even increased its popularity over the centuries, but it should be pointed out incurred harsh criticism as well. While literary scholars might point to the history of multiple sources, accruals and rewritings as the reason for the play's artistic shortcomings, anthropologists might prefer to look at the result of these layering processes in cultural terms. So I think this is the interesting thing about the play, and I've kind of pointed it out here. There are 3 main areas that I think the play kind of deals with, interesting representations and gaps and differences. We have the play's kind of aspects of medieval qualities and its Renaissance qualities. Its Catholic and its Protestant influences that mostly kind of centres around the ghost, but also some issues of morality, as well as the English kind of the tropes that very much set this play in line with kind of English culture and Elizabethan and specifically Shakespearean culture, as well as the elements that are kind of artificially there to feel foreign, to give it a sense of difference and distinctness as a kind of theatrical society. And I think that mostly operates actually in terms of we look at the monarchy in the play and the potentially pseudo-electoral system that we see here. Okay, so with all that in mind, I think this whole thing suggests an ambiguity in the play, and I think the key thing that all of this suggests, all of these things have, is I'm going to really bang on about this theme for the whole of this session, is that sense of uncertainty and doubt in Hamlet. The world of the play is transitioning from medieval to a Renaissance one. Hamlet, as I will continually talking about on the course, is representative of this new philosophical Renaissance prince, whereas perhaps old Hamlet, his now dead father, is reminiscent of the kind of medieval warrior kings, the kind of pious but brutal military rulers of the previous kind of era. Remember though, guys, that terms like medieval and Renaissance are not terms that would necessarily be being used about these things at their own time. Shakespeare is never sitting down going, oh, I'm going to include some medieval elements and some Renaissance elements. He is just presenting characters as he sees them, but we can now project onto them historically. This is the kind of qualities that each of these figures represents, and it suggests a changing mindset. And you'll see this a lot in modern narratives as well, where you'll see from one decade to another characters that kind of perhaps represent an older time period tend to get shuffled off and die. Okay, so let's have a look at the play itself. Here we are, the first page. So we open on the battlements of the castle that I've shown you already. Here are some themes as well I've put on the side here. I'll hide them in a second, but I just want to kind of remember these are the main ones I could figure for this session. So grief, death, power and class, supernatural elements, and politics of the court. So let's get rid of those. There we go. And let's move on with the play. So we start on the battlements, we assume, of... There's no actual direction here. Again, we get a lengthy footnote to explain where and why they might be. But all we know is that we have two guards. Realistically, it will be some kind of military position. They want to reinforce at the start of the play the nature of what's going on in terms of the military build-up. I think that's the key to this opening, is this idea of uncertainty is kind of building up, and it's actually started with the first line. I will talk about this endlessly. This first line is so key for establishing tonality in the play. Bernardo's questioning of who's there establishes three key things. First of them being obviously doubt and just kind of uncertainty. So doubt and uncertainty, suspicion as well, and the sense of tension, because it's we don't know who or what he's talking to. So I think these three kind of tonal qualities are set really easy here, and especially developed upon when Francisco directly answers his question by refusing to answer the question and instead challenging Bernardo to rework his own question, which is, as you know from conversations with people, not how you answer questions. We then have this lengthy kind of section of short lines, sometimes split lines or broken lines, whatever you want to call them here. So we have this set of broken lines here. Long live the king, Bernardo, he, as a kind of a back and forth between the two of them, trying essentially to establish, I think here we're trying to establish in our characters a sense of unease and nervousness. Partly because obviously, you're guards, you're on duty, but as we'll quickly discover, I think that unease, as we all know, hopefully, having had a look at even basic cultural knowledge about Hamlet, the ghost is obviously soon incoming. They talk to each other. You come most carefully upon your hour. 'Tis now struck 12. Get thee to bed, Francisco. For this relief, much thanks. 'Tis bitter cold, and I am sick at heart. Have you had quiet guard? Not a mouse stirring. Well, good night. If you do meet Horatio and Marcellus, the rivals of my watch, bid them make haste. So we have this nice mix of a couple of things here. They talk about the nature. We establish some setting. 'Tis bitter cold. It's a nice bit of pathetic fallacy. A sense of weariness and unhappiness. The language of sickness comes in immediately. I am sick at heart. That's kind of really common in the play, this idea of sickness. It will come back in Hamlet. It will come back in The King. It will come back, I think, with almost all of the main cast, at least at some point, an idea, a fear around kind of being sick, being unwell. I would also point out as well here that there's a nice little bit of linguistic stuff we can pick upon. Bernardo shifts at this point here to the more informal and personal second person address, thee or thou. In this case, it's thee. And he uses that when he's talking about Francisco's kind of like well-being. For the rest of it, they use the much more formal you to suggest their kind of professional interaction. And you'll see that they use you whenever they're talking about guarding or doing their job, your hour. Okay? So Francisco gets ready to leave. We repeat the question here again. We repeat the same idea that we've had already, and it's essentially done with the same structure. We have the split lines again. In this time, it's in fact two characters entering the stage, Horatio and Marcellus, who focus on two things. One, friends, and two, liegemen, so friendship and loyalty. And this is actually themes that Horatio himself is associated with throughout the play. Not a surprise here. The Dane here specifically referring to the King of Denmark, and that in this case would be Claudius, Hamlet's uncle, who has now become king. They exchange their kind of goodbyes and hellos and stuff, and we have Horatio here, the character who is supposed to be, I think, distinct as much as he can be from the rest of the cast. Is only a piece of Horatio. He's only partly there, possibly because it's cold or late or unwillingness or whatever it is. But Horatio seems to have been roped into this. And as Marcellus suggests here on the next page, that Horatio's presence here is more forced than anything else. He has been brought along by the guards, who we assume themselves not particularly either literate or whatever, not necessarily literate, but certainly not educated, that they have brought him along to speak and approve their own things. So we start establishing something, whatever it is. It's their fantasy, dreaded sight, this dreaded sight, we don't know what that is, and this apparition. So we have this kind of ambiguous being talked about here, some kind of supernatural being here. I can't remember which one of my themes has, but they're just as a reminder. That's already, I think, no. There is actually an issue of power and class here. We'll talk about that in a second. There it is. It's supernatural. So, the apparition comes here, so this apparition, the supernatural kind of element coming in here, but there is also a sense of power and class, and I've accidentally put it up there, but let's go through it. Horatio is a scholar. He is from the same university, we assume, as Hamlet has come from, and he has the ability, they believe, because of his kind of scholarly qualities. I would imagine specifically, when we talk about speaking to it, we would imagine it's the speaking of Latin. If you are religious and you believe in ghosts as a possibility of speaking to and that you'd want to speak to, you would imagine that given the language of Christianity, specifically at the time, specifically Catholicism at the time, not Protestantism, but specifically Catholicism was in Latin, then that might be perhaps a reason why Horatio has been asked to come. And it's nice that it's not Hamlet, because it gives us an outsider's perspective at the start of the story. We don't get the kind of protagonist's perspective here. We get something else to set us and establish Denmark before we meet Hamlet. And I think that's actually a really important note to make here. You'll find that's actually quite common in Shakespeare's tragedies. There will be short scenes that establish the play's world without needing the protagonist. It's the same thing, I believe, happens in Romeo and Juliet. And you can also look at something like Othello, where we see he's not really a protagonist. He has the most lines. The kind of villainous Iago opens that play with some mischief. So we establish this narrative of fortification of the assault on ears. This is a nice bit of language that they're going to assail or attack Horatio's ears with the story that they have two knights seen. Now Horatio's ears are fortified. He doesn't want to hear what they have to say, but this is also a nice setup for the fact that the old king was poisoned via the ear by the new king. who has just taken the throne in Claudius. So Bernardo starts to speak, and this is actually a lovely bit of language here I would talk about. Bernardo, when he attempts to tell his story to Horatio and Marcellus, starts using this kind of archaic poetic language that we don't really see much else in the play. He goes fully elaborate with it, and I think this is fundamentally as a means of establishing this as a style of storytelling. Yeah, it's making this as opposed to, I suppose, the slightly more naturalistic dialogue, although obviously it's poetic, it's all written in iambic pentameter. These characters in fact do speak in verse, which is quite interesting given that they're not the courtiers, but they're clearly alongside them with Horatio. But Bernardo ups the register a little bit. Yond, same start. Yond at this point, realistically, even at that point, an anachronism a little bit, is slightly archaic. Yon, same star that's westward from the pole, has made its course to illume that part of heaven where it now burns. Marcellus and myself, the bell then beating once. So he starts using these poetic syntax inversions, so he reworks the sentence structures. The only other time in the play where I'd say the language really mirrors this is in the play within the play, in Act 3, Scene 2 later on, where the players have this particular style of language going on. So let's move on to see the ghost. Enter ghost at the bottom of the page there. And the characters address the ghost. Peace, break thee off. Obviously power and class going now. But supernatural very much still here. Look where it comes again, or maybe power to it. In the same figure, like the king that's dead. Thou art a scholar. There we go. Now we know Horatio's a scholar. Speak to it, Horatio. Looks are not like the king. Mark it, Horatio. Most like it harrows me with fear and wonder. So this section here just establishes that it looks like the king that dead. But I think the key that's dead. That's that's fine. That's a bit of context. But here, this is the fun word. It's like the king. Looks are not like the king. Most like it harrows me with fear and wonder. So we can look at the way in actually here that this kind of like this comparative language is used rather than it is the king. We don't have that essentialism here that the king is the ghost. What we have is that the ghost is like the king, a figure like it, which is actually a significant difference when we get to it in a second. Horatio goes on over here. Once he gets to try and talk to the king, we'll establish that point in full here. He says, "What art thou?" He uses this kind of more personal approach as well. He seems to directly address it rather than using the formal, which is interesting given that this is the king, which suggests a certain attitude towards the spirit, that he doesn't believe necessarily that the spirit is the king itself, maybe. That usurped this time of night, together with that fair and warlike form in which the majesty of buried Denmark did sometimes march. By heaven I charge thee, speak. So Horatio relies upon religion here, and kind of decency to ask the spirit why it adopts the form, why it usurps this time of night. Now the word usurp is to take kind of like unlawfully, I suppose, that it has kind of stolen, and this is actually a nice thematic tie to the Claudius himself. But it kind of essentially like, why are you walking around in the body, in the appearance of the old king? And he relies on religion to get the ghost to here. Now this all ties into a key conflict, which there will be resources available on Teams for this, and hopefully just a couple of Prezi sessions as well, so you can go on there and have a look at them, or PowerPoints, whatever they may be. That talk about the nature of ghosts, but the clear point is fundamentally is that obviously for a Catholic perspective, ghosts are a positive figure who are on earth because they're not progressing into the afterlife, and Protestants viewed ghosts as a sinister figure. They did not believe that purgatory existed, and therefore in the Protestant faith, ghosts were not such a positive thing. They were mischievous, they were tricksters, they were there to mislead and to damn, which is perhaps why Horatio is so distinctly unimpressed by the ghost. Okay. Now, this point of view, I wouldn't spend ages in an exam talking about the core differences between Catholicism and Protestantism on this point, other than the fact that it creates a really ambiguous and uncertain tone and a really anxious tone, the fact that they don't know where this ghost fits into kind of almost theological positions, and this creates perhaps a large portion of the doubt that Hamlet has across the play. He himself does not feel confident in the nature of the ghost, even though it may appear like his own father. So they attempt to get the ghost to stay on. It does not, and Bernardo is kind of concerned seemingly for Horatio. You tremble and look pale. Is not this something more than fancy? What think you on it? Essentially, what is this? Now you've seen the ghost, what do you think? And he says, before my God, I might not disbelieve without the sensible and true avouch. So the vouch, the kind of vouching for of his own eyes. He's like, look, I wouldn't have believed you until I saw the ghost myself. He's been convinced to come out here and kind of check, and he has now found it to be things. He's like, is it not like the king? And he's like, yup. And now we get this big old context expositionary section. Horatio's like, yeah, it's exactly like the king, specifically when he, the ambitious Norway, combated. So frowned he once, when in an angry pile he smote the sledded pole out to the ice. So we get this backstory that the old king was military successful and had a fight. And there has been previous conflict between Denmark, where the play is set, and Norway at some point in the past. And Marcellus is like, yep, he's done this several times now. He's been walking around like this, and this is how he looks. And Horatio starts giving us this ominous kind of quality. And this is actually quite a common feature in tragedy, isn't it? This sense of an ominous, almost fate-like kind of quality to it. He says that this interaction from the ghost bodes some strange eruption to our state, that there is a premonition of something terrible to come. So Marcellus then obviously is like, okay, let's sit me down and tell me what's going on in the land in general, because I'm a little bit confused. And this is where we get really explicitly quite expositionary. Horatio's kind of suggested that something dodgy might be going on, and then Marcellus uses that perhaps as an opportunity, and Shakespeare uses that as an opportunity, to have Marcellus ask what is going on. He says that, look, in Denmark right now, we are working so hard. So nightly toil is the subject of land. So our people are working throughout the night. We are spending a lot of money on brazen cannon, on cannons, and we are going to foreign market for implements of war. So weapons and whatever else. He says, why such impress or forced labour of shipwrights? People who build boats, obviously, whose sore task does not divide the Sunday from the week, i.e. they are working 7 days of the week, they are working 24/7, the people of Denmark. He's like, why are we with such sweaty haste making night joint labour of the day? Why are we just working so hard? Why are we out here guarding all the time? What is going on? Yeah, what can you tell me? And then Horatio is like, well, immediately he's like, I can tell you, or at least I got some rumours why. And then he goes into this backstory, talking about how he just says, as you know, Fortinbras by Norway was, by his pride, dared to combat, and he and Hamlet, the old Hamlet this is, not the Hamlet of the title, this is the old Hamlet, killed that Fortinbras. So in some kind of pride, honour-based duel, the old Hamlet killed the old King Fortinbras of Norway. And when he slayed with him, they had a seal. They had like a kind of deal. They had a kind of honour-bound deal, ratified by law and heraldry. So within the kind of laws of the time, heraldry obviously all about kind of familial honour, and law obviously the law. Did forfeit or give up with his life all these his lands. So the lands that the play is now taking place in, the castle that I showed you earlier, which he stood seized of to the conqueror, against by which. A moiety competent again. This is equivalent section of land. Yeah, so we would have lost land if we had lost, but old Hamlet won instead. So he now believing, I suppose, so this is all done, and he gets the section. He takes it to Hamlet. Hamlet wins the land, old Hamlet that is. And that's where the play is taking place. Now, young Fortinbras, we assume the son of old Fortinbras, of unimproved metals, so somebody who has not yet been fully kind of structured and developed, hot and fiery. He's really up for it. and he's gone around Norway getting together a group of kind of bandits and ruffians and the kind of worst and roughest of people, lawless resolutes for food and diet to some enterprise. So he's sharked them up. He's gotten together this group who are going to go around and hopefully, if I can ever work out how to turn this page, there we go. And they seem to be trying to come in for those lands that his father lost. And he says, this is why we are getting prepared. We need to be ready for Fortinbras to attend and attack us. And Bernardo's like, oh, okay, wow, I think that might be, that sounds pretty serious. But it might also be that this portentous figure comes armed through our watch, so like the king that was the question of these wars. So he's like, there might be a connection here between the fact that this is all kicking off and the ghost that's come back was the king that was the king in that battle. He's like, look, maybe there's a kind of connection there. And Horatio is like, yeah, it is actually. This is something to trouble the mind's eye. A mote is like a bit of dust in your eye, famously painful and irritating. It doesn't go away. And he uses this metaphor that this fact is a mote to the mind's eye, your kind of thought. So it's like when you have something that's just lodged in your mind and you can't get it out, you can't stop thinking about it. It's irritating. Horatio uses this metaphor quite nicely here, I think. In the most high and palmy state of Rome, a little before Ear, the mightiest Julius fell, so that's Julius Caesar. So famous dictator of Rome, not emperor, remember, but famous dictator of Rome. Before he was killed, specifically Julius Caesar, obviously, as we all know, hopefully, was killed by his senators when he tried to become declared a dictator for life. And as a quick contextual note to mention here, there we go. Oh no, spinning around a bit. Just knock the text there. Yeah, as a quick kind of context note, and I probably should have had this context note up through all of that ghost stuff. But as a context note, Shakespeare had himself produced a play of Julius Caesar, but a year or two before this one was performed for the first time. That play's fine, I would say. Julius Caesar, I would say it's probably 2/3 really good, 1/3 okay. Everything up until Julius Caesar's death and just after it. So once you get up to all of the monologues and the kind of really powerful rhetoric in that play is excellent, and then at the end where they hunt down Brutus and Cassius is less fun. It just kind of loses its way a bit. But funnily enough, also has ghosts in it, and he mentions that here. The graves stood tenantless, so the graves were emptied, and the sheeted dead did squeak and gibber in the Roman streets at stars with trains of fire and dews of blood. So we get this hugely apocalyptic imagery of this kind of like rising of the dead and kind of blood stars, disasters in the sun, and the moist star, the moon, upon whose influence Neptune's empire stands, was sick almost to doomsday with eclipse. So there was this kind of like eclipse in the sky, this almost apocalyptic scenario happened before Julius was killed. And even the like precursor of feared events as harbingers, preceding still the fates and prologue to the omen coming on, have heaven and earth together demonstrated unto our climatures and countrymen. So he says basically, look, we should be afeared that this ghost brings us some kind of bad omen. And then the ghost comes back. Horatio kind of stops off again, but soft. But anytime any character says something like "but soft," that is essentially a kind of like shh, be quiet, hang on. Low, where it comes again. Low, like many other terms in the text, is an exclamative phrase. Whenever they say something like "low," "marry," anything like that, it's an exclamative. It doesn't necessarily have a kind of meaning function. What it has is a kind of conversational function, a discourse function. So that's just something to. So don't worry about the word "marry," especially because that's going to come up later on. It does not mean to get married. It's a corruption of the Saint Mary. Stay illusion, and he grabs he tries to grab. It spreads its arms out. The ghost, we assume, then and it essentially is a kind of maybe a rejection of it. If that's how any sound or voice speak to me, and we will find out later that the ghost does have a voice, but that it just does not want to. It does not speak here at this point. If there be any good thing to be done that may do thee to that may to thee do ease and grace to me, speak to me. If thou art privy to the country's fate, which happily for knowing may avoid, O speak. Or if thou have uphoarded in thy life, extorted treasure in the womb of earth, for which they say your spirits oft walk in death, speak of it, stay and speak. So Horatio tries and thinks, he uses all of his kind of like knowledge of ghosts. He's like, maybe you have this to say, maybe you have this to say, something about the country, or to give me some ease, or whether you have something kind of, if you have something that was kept behind in life that we can find. He's like, and he can't do it. The ghost remains silent. At that point, the cock crows, so the cockerel crows for the dawn. Now we might think, hang on a minute, weren't they just saying 'tis just past midnight? This cock is crowing quite early. Maybe there's just a kind of abstract passage of time. Maybe it's the fact that we're in Denmark and the sun might rise a lot earlier than normal. Who knows? Marcellus asks whether he should strike it with his weapon, his partisan. And Horatio's like, look, that might work if it doesn't stay here. And they try, and they can't, because the ghost is incorporeal, and it leaves. And we then have a kind of reminiscent at the end here. So he says, okay, Marcellus is like, I actually did it wrong to show it violence. I think this was perhaps a kind of almost immoral thing for him to do. And Bernardo is like, oh, it was about to speak when the cock crew. We don't know that's obviously down to performance, whether it shows it as nearly speaking or not, or whether that's Bernardo projecting onto it. And Horatio says, it started like a guilty thing upon a fearful summons. I have heard the cock that is a trumpet to the morn, doth with his lofty and shrill sounding throat awake the god of day, and at his warning, whether in sea or fire, in earth or air, the extravagant and erring spirit hies to his confine, and of the truth herein, this present object made probation. So this, the rising of the sun has almost kind of caused the ghost to guiltily shrink away. I think there's actually an interesting idea that suggests almost that the ghost might not be a good thing. Is actually quite an interesting way of thinking about this here. As well as that, there's lots of kind of folkloric content here, the gods of day, and the kind of the slightly less Christian nature of this. I think all the description around the kind of ghost is interestingly a mix of kind of superstition and religion, because it then shifts over to here to fade on the crowing of the cock. Some say that ever against the season comes wherein our Saviour's birth is celebrated, this bird of dawning singeth all night long. And then they say, no spirit dare stir abroad, the nights are wholesome, there no planets strike, nor fairy tales, nor witch hath power to charm, so hallowed and so gracious at that time. So this is almost a kind of religious cleansing at this time, gets rid of kind of witchcraft and stuff. So we're building up a greater sense of tension about the ghost here, especially about its intentions, if it is a guilty figure. So Horatio says, yep, I have also heard this, and I partly believe it. And that's an interesting thing about Horatio here, is that perhaps, the skeptical reasons why he's been out here in the first place, he was already a skeptical figure, wasn't he? And here he's like, yeah, I partly believe that this is a kind of supernatural thing, but there's maybe something else more to it as well. And he says, look, the morn in russet mantle clad walks o'er the dew of yon high eastward hill. Break we our watch up, and by my advice, let us impart what we have seen tonight to young Hamlet. So let's go and tell young Hamlet what's gone on. He says, for upon my life, the spirit dumb to us will surely speak to him, basically. So whatever's going on, it's his father's ghost. Probably it might talk to Hamlet, if it is, in fact, a ghost at all. Or at least if it's a good ghost. And Marcellus says, yep, I agree with that. And let's go and find him now. That'll be good. So hopefully lots of stuff there to talk about the ghost. Now I want to quickly talk about staging and the ghost before we move on. Obviously the ghost, a supernatural figure, quite hard to show on stage. There's no special effects at the time. He can't visualize in. They can't fade him in. So what we do have instead is often techniques used like this on the floor here, We see the trapdoor at the theatre, which would have existed. As well as that, there were some theatres that had like pulley systems so that the ghost could descend. Sometimes they might have a door at the back of the stage where he would appear quite quickly. Sometimes they can use various things. Sometimes he'll come through the audience. I think you'll find is that there's lots of creative different ways of showing the ghost. What you should also note as well is that because we're establishing a ghost as this kind of like figure of military historical kind of prowess, what you will often see is the ghost will be represented in a slightly older, usually a generation before's military outfit, although in this case he kind of looks like a fancy sailor man. I'm not really sure what's going on in that production there, but what you will find is that he often is in a slightly more archaic style of writing, not writing, of dress, which is something unique to note about the ghost. So the opening scene, we don't really have anything about young Hamlet at all until the very end of the scene, where we talk about going and seeing young Hamlet. That's his first mention. The majority of the focus has been on the history of Denmark, its kind of warlike past with Norway, the fact that that might be coming up again as a problem now, so we're setting this kind of background uncertainty, and we established the ghost's kind of qualities. We established its likeness to the old king, who we get a lovely description of as this kind of military figure of great victories and strength, but also that the characters are slightly uncertain about A, what the ghost means for Denmark, and B, what the future will hold, and the morality of the ghost itself. There's a doubt about that, especially from Horatio. So, scene 2, we then think, okay, fine, first scene done, no Hamlet. Well, maybe this scene will be about Horatio and Marcellus going and telling no, that does not happen. What we get instead is we get Claudius, the new king of Denmark, Gertrude, his queen, and his council, including Polonius and his son Laertes, Hamlet, with others including Voltaman and Cornelius. So we get the full whack of characters here. So, the king, and I'm not going to read through every single part of the king's speech here because it's very long, and realistically it's actually, I think, quite an accessible speech, and I'm going to talk about maybe why it's actually quite an accessible speech in a second. But the king here establishes himself in the play. He is the new king. We have nothing on him at this point in the play. We don't know how sinister or violent and vile he is as an antagonist yet. We will find that out later on. But what we do get is his presentation here. And he is very much this kind of political figure. He gives this big, lengthy monologue to the kind of council surrounding him. We assume now, just after his marriage to Gertrude, the queen, the former wife of the old king, who we've just seen the ghost of, and often this scene is actually sometimes set in a kind of almost a kind of marital style, as a kind of wedding theme in terms of the dress and whatever else. So he says, though yet of Hamlet now, but obviously we are talking about old Hamlet here, our dear brother's death. He uses the plural, our and we throughout. Partly to show display his power as a monarch, that is a kind of traditional there, but also as a kind of political tool to link him and his position to the state. The memory be green, i.e. recent, and that it us befitted to bear our hearts in grief, and our whole kingdom to be contracted in one brow of woe. Yet so far hath discretion fought with nature, that we with wisest sorrow think on him together with remembrance of ourselves. So, yep, we have all done good sorrow for the old king. Everyone was sad, but we've been very sensible about it. And now that that's done, and that we've kind of thought about ourselves, and we've actually gone, yep, put everything in context. He says, my sometime sister, i.e. his sister-in-law previously, now our queen. And that sentence there, linking sister to queen, is not unintentional. It sounds gross, because it's kind of supposed to be Hamlet and old Hamlet will spend the rest of the play accusing the two of a kind of incestuous relationship, and this certainly would be considered, at least by certain kind of religious beliefs of the time, especially Catholicism probably mid 16th century Catholicism certainly would have viewed this relationship of marrying your brother's widow who has had a child that we know about. You know, Hamlet is doing stuff, so it was not an unconsummated marriage. This would have been considered incestuous. Now, not many characters in the play view this as an incestuous act. No one else references it other than Hamlet and his father's ghost. So there we go. It's a tricky one. So she's viewed as the imperial jointress to this warlike state. Have we, as 'twere, with a defeated joy and auspicious and drooping eye, with mirth and funeral and with dirge and marriage in equal scale, weighing delight and dole taken to wife. So this phrase here especially discusses the fact that they as a group have made the decision here on the basis of they have made this decision on like we've weighed up the pros and cons. I didn't do this because I want to. We've taken the most sensible course of action, me and our counsellors, to establish this as the decision that we're going to go with. We're going to get married. Okay, so this is interesting. It sets up a slightly different perspective to, I suppose, a kind of Elizabethan monarchy, where you would expect perhaps a more traditional patrilineal inheritance of the kingship. You would expect it to go to Hamlet, but for whatever reason, the council or whoever, the political system of the society, have decided that Claudius will become king. And he then does a recap. Once you got this, he's like, well done, we are all happy with this decision. I would have a look at the footnotes if you want a little bit more detail on that, but I think that's pretty straightforward. He does a recap then of all the stuff that we've just heard from. We've just heard from Horatio in the opening scene, and he reminds us that this new Fortinbras thinks that Claudius is not as strong as the old king was, or at least thinks that Denmark's a little bit kind of troubled at the moment. He is trying to come and take us on, and he's like, look, that's what he's going to do. What I have done is I've written to his uncle, the old king of the king of Norway, so young Fortinbras, also himself not king. And we know that he is perhaps, because of his lack of power and because of his bedrid status, he's perhaps either crippled or elderly. He scarcely hears of his nephew's purpose. So we're starting up a really nice parallel here between Hamlet and young Hamlet and young Fortinbras. Both are princes to their nations. Both have had the king above them taken by their uncles. Both of them will soon want revenge. But the king has written to this old Norway, and he sends off Cornelius and Voltermand, who literally only appear for this purpose, to go off and have a chat with this king. This is establishing Claudius much more along the lines of, I suppose, what would be traditional for a Renaissance or 16th century king, monarch, against perhaps the kind of previous violence of the old king Hamlet, in that he is much more prone to diplomacy rather than straight violence. And I think that's the kind of key thing here, is that Claudius is not going like, right, even though they've been buying all these weapons clearly as a defensive measure, Claudius is like, right, get me my armor, we're going out to smash Fortinbras, we're going to go out and kick him. He said like, well, I've written these letters to his uncle and I'm sure he'll sort it out for me. He doesn't want to get involved in war, and I don't want to say that this is necessarily a bad thing. I don't think that just because it's new, well, not even new, this is what is contemporary, this is not necessarily a thing. I think this is just saying, look, now people engage in diplomacy a lot more. You would expect maybe however many years ago there'd maybe be a war about this, now there wouldn't be. And I don't think this is inherently negative, but what I would say is that it builds up to the characterization of Claudius later on as this kind of more sinister political figure that has kind of a much more of an interest in intrigue and manipulation and control, and what we are going to call and there'll be lessons on this in class, and I might even do a separate video on this, what we're going to call a Machiavellian figure, somebody who subscribes to the philosophy of the writer Niccolo Machiavelli, who writes a lot about the kind of the ability of the individual to take and maintain power through underhand techniques. Now, with all of this in mind, the king is kind of establishing himself here as a person in control. He is here. He's talking in this plural address. He's told us what is happening, what he's doing about it. He's like, I am sorting this out. Don't you worry. we're all doing this, we've all married these things, I am now the kind of new person in control. He's establishing himself as the prime figure in the play. He is the king. I've given you a really interesting article that I read earlier today about actually some productions of the play in the Middle East from 1975 onwards that really have some interesting interpretations of Claudius as a figure in terms of the way in which they view him very much as a kind of crushing tyrant. So I would perhaps suggest you go and have a look at them in the notes that I sent over to you, and that are on the teams as well. So the king then kind of continued his kind of show of like benevolent kingship by passing on to Polonius, and he starts talking to his son Laertes. So Polonius' son Laertes has a suit. Now a suit for a monarch would just be a kind of request, a desire for something, and in this case, like I suppose a lawsuit now, this is where you are just backing up your suit with the law, that he is asking something, and he says, "You cannot speak of reason to the Dane and lose your voice. What wouldst thou be, Laertes? Thou shalt not be my offer, not thy asking. Thy head is not more native to the heart, the hand more instrumental to the mouth than is the throne of Denmark to thy father. What wouldst thou have, Laertes?" So it's like, look, I am a really big fan of your dad. He is really good, and I would, answer any of his requests. So come on, Laertes, don't lose your tongue. Tell me what you want. Like a kind of benevolent Santa Claus in a shopping centre, the king will grant that request. I think this is actually a nice thing. I've put a full essay on this on Teams, but Polonius' interaction with the king seems to be, that Polonius is willing to do almost anything for the king, and Claudius, while not always having confidence in Polonius at all times, certainly has his respect. The king's respect is obvious. I think that's really firmly established in this opening scene, that there's a clear respect between Polonius and Claudius, two figures who ultimately are associated with politicking. No surprise. Laertes has this very formalised, seemingly pre-written, I don't know why I've still got supernatural up here, there's literally no supernatural in the scene, but there is a lot of this. So we have this very kind of formal, almost pre-written, and in fact in some productions you'll find that Polonius is kind of either prompting, mouthing, or something along behind this. He said, "I came to Denmark to show my duty in your coronation, i.e. you becoming king, and now I just want to go." He's like, I want to go back to France, that's where I was studying, can I go back there? We don't necessarily know Laertes is going to university in the same way that Hamlet is, we'll come back to that later. Reasons like that. The king is like, have you got Polonius's leave? Polonius is like, yep, he's wrung it from me, So perhaps Polonius here kind of over-exaggerating a little bit by labors and petitions. He's like, no, he's gotten this out of me, and I'm like, okay, I've given in and I've let him do it. So the king's like, fine, on you go, Laertes. Have a good time. And now he turns to his... he saved it till last, I think perhaps to build up to this moment, to show him being as benevolent as possible. The king turns to his cousin Hamlet and his son. Now the reason why the word cousin is used here, obviously he's not a cousin in the modern sense, but the word cousin was often a stand-in for any kind of extended familial relation beyond immediate family. So cousin is often used interchangeably for like uncle, aunt, actual cousins, and various other relations like that. So he starts using cousin and then changes it to his son now that he's obviously become his father, a stepfather, so to speak. And the grossness, again, of this is really not accidental. It's supposed to feel a bit uncomfortable. Hamlet then starts with his kind of wordplay, his punnage. He starts with a little more than kin and less than kind. So, you're closer than, you're a little bit more than kin, i.e. like distant relatives, but you are less than kind. And Hamlet is not obviously happy with the king. This is in public, by the way, and this is Hamlet's first line. This is in front of the whole court. This is Hamlet, your protagonist for the play, and he's just like, "I don't like you, Dad," and that's basically his opening line to the play. And it's just like, well, he doesn't even refer to him as Dad. He's imagine Dad in that in like air quotes. This is like a really weird introduction for your tragic protagonist, especially within what will turn out to be a kind of a revenge tragedy. And I've given you another quote here from a text I read earlier. in terms of the way in which Shakespeare presents Hamlet as an atypical, and I think that's the key term, guys, is atypical hero of revenge tragedy, and in fact not really a man of action at all. Yeah, so that Hamlet is not an action-based figure. He's not a kind of direct revenger, as we have seen in other plays, as you'll see in Coriolanus, as you'll see in perhaps Bosola when we in our Duchess of Malfi studies. Bosola, a much more violent figure. Who gets on with stuff. Still feels a little bit guilty about it, but he will still stab you. Hamlet here, much less of a kind of aggressive figure and functionally very atypical in terms of heroic presentation. He does not seem like a hero, especially after you've had that whole first scene talking about his father. So the king is like, oh, how is it that the clouds still hang on you? You know, why are you still sad? I don't know. And Hamlet plays on this again. He takes the word clouds, uses it for its weather meaning rather than its kind of like, you know, mood meaning, and says that he is too much in the sun. The sun here spelt as a child, not the sun outside, suggesting that he is like, I am too much linked to my father. And the queen is like, oh, come on, Hamlet, get rid of your moody colours and look on like a friend on Denmark, i.e. the king, not the country, but his uncle. He said, look, stop spending forever looking with thy veiled lids. Stop trying to find your noble father in the dust. We know that he's dead. We all know that everyone dies and everyone passes through nature into eternity. And Hamlet's like, yep, it is common. So Hamlet kind of, again, taking people's words and playing around with them. He's clearly an intellectual. He's got some wordplay. He's got some smarts about him. If it be Hamlet, if it is common, then why does it seem so particular with you, with thee? Why are you so upset about this? And what you will find is that, unlike the king at this point, the queen uses the more personal, informal thee here, and Hamlet rejects her almost entirely. Seems, madam, nay, it is. So Hamlet rejects the idea that it seems bad with him, that he said it is bad. It's not just that it looks bad; it is bad. And this establishes one of the key themes in the play, which I haven't actually put up as a little thing, but this idea of appearance, what is on the outside, versus the kind of reality, what is underneath. Yeah, Hamlet is constantly talking about this difference between what things look like they are and what things actually are. This has already been actually established with the ghost, that it looks like him, the king, but it might not be him. Here it's that Hamlet is talking about it in terms of public performance, and that will go throughout the play. He certainly seems to be critical of the court, establishing him as what we might contextually call a malcontent figure. Yeah, this is a stock character, and we have talked about this with the Duchess of Malfi all the time, but he is a malcontent figure, isolating himself from the court. So, Hamlet says, "'Tis not alone my inky cloak, cold mother here being perhaps a kind of like a stepmother kind of figure, nor customary spirits of solemn black, nor windy perspiration of forced breath." She's like, he basically just runs through, like, it's not that I've got dark clothes, or that I'm sighing, or that I'm crying here, or that my face is sad, and it's none of these forms, moods, and shapes. It's none of the kind of visual appearances of grief that can actually identify me. This is just seeming, and anyone can play these. And this idea of acting and performance comes in here, which comes back throughout the play, obviously most clearly in the middle when we have the play within the play itself, where the play goes fully and overtly meta-theatrical. That's a nice term you can think about there in terms of context of production, is that meta-theatre, the idea of plays that comment upon themselves. But I have that within which passes show, but the trappings and shit. So I've got feelings inside that are more genuine than anything that I could be doing externally. Basically, like, you can't understand me, Mum, is Hamlet. I've got real feelings inside. That's essentially the narrative here. The king is like, okay, that's lovely. It's really nice that you've done these mourning duties to your dad, but you remember that your dad lost his dad, and his dad lost his dad, and everyone before them has lost their father at some point. And they were bound in filial obligation, i.e. your kind of duty as a son, for some term to do obsequious sorrow. This idea of filial obligation will come back in Act 1, Scene 5. We will come back to that. He says, yes, you had to do some sorrow, but to keep on with the sorrow, to persever. I'm not ever sure why it says persever. I'm not why it's persevere. I see it's just a variant, I assume, in terms of persisting. I'm not really sure why that one has ever used. But he's like, look, we all do the dutiful sorrow, but if you keep being sad, that's actually just being stubborn. That's not being, good at all. You're being, your impious stubbornness. You're doing it against religion. It's unmanly, and it shows a will most incorrect to heaven. So the king escalates this from basically nothing to quite high quickly. He's like, yeah, it's nice that you're doing this, but actually, it's against your gender and it's against God to mourn so much for your father. He's like, look, it shows a heart unfortified, a mind impatient, and understanding simpled and unschooled, for what we know must be, and it is as common as any of the most vulgar thing to sense. Why should we, in our peevish opposition, take it to heart? So the king basically absolutely destroys Hamlet in front of everybody here. He's like, look, it's unmanly, it's stupid, it's weak, and realistically, we all just know this should happen, so just get over it. Just get over your dad dying unexplainedly in his garden one afternoon. Why should we even think about that? So we'll get to the king's guilt later on the course. So 5, 'tis a fault to heaven, a fault against the dead, a fault to nature, to reason most absurd, whose common theme is death of fathers, and who still hath cried from the first corpse to that die today, this must be so. So the king's like, it's a fault against the dead, and a fault to nature, making Hamlet seem almost perverse in his mourning. This is a real kind of establishment of Hamlet is not a kind of like normal figure. He's kind of he's some kind of outcast already. The king is then like, this unprevailing woe. Get rid of this unprevailing woe and think of us as of a father. Think of me as your dad. And he's like, look, you're the closest to my throne, and I love you the same way that a father loves his own son. And he's like, look, I want you to stay here. I don't want you to go back to Wittenberg, and I want you to stay here in the chief and comfort of our eye, cheer and comfort of our chiefest courtier, cousin, and our sensei. He's like, look, we all love you. We don't want you to go back to Wittenberg. Now, incidentally, guys, this is a context note that will make more sense in a couple of lessons' time when we talk about the ghost. But Wittenberg was the town in Germany whose university Hamlet attends, obviously, but also was the university wherein Martin Luther, the Protestant reformer, published his kind of like theses and his rejection of the Catholic Church. So it's in a location inherently tied to Protestantism, and this is going to come back when we come to Act 1, Scene 4 and 5, when we look at Hamlet's kind of interactions with the ghost and the anxieties around it there. Okay? So the king is like, look, just stay here, and the queen follows this up with, let not thy mother lose her prayers, Hamlet, I pray thee stay. So he continues on with the thee. What you'll find is that the king almost always stays with the you, your interest, and that kind of stuff. You are. So the king still always, perhaps as the monarch, perhaps because it's a formal location and setting, the king always stays with the kind of formal and kind of public you. The queen almost always goes with the informal and personal thee. A nice relationship suggested there, the closest between the characters. Hamlet's like, okay, I will obey you, madam. So he directs his address to the queen and not to the king. He's not obeying the king here, he is obeying his mother. That suggests again a divide in the relationship between Hamlet and the king. It is clear from this first scene in the play that the Hamlet and the king's relationship is really uncomfortable and rocky. The king is like, well, that's a loving and fair reply, that will do. Be as ourselves in Denmark, i.e. treat, live large, live positively. You are free to do what you want. Madam, come. This gentle and unforced accord of Hamlet. He's like, we didn't force this out of him at all, despite my lengthy monologue. Sit smiling to my heart, and in grace whereof, no jocund or like joyous health that I drink, i.e. no drink that I take tonight, shall be unmatched by the, basically, every time I drink later on this evening, I'm not going to go through because there's a bit of complex grammar there, but basically every time I drink this evening, we're going to fire off the guns. It's a tradition, let's do that. Which sounds great. Great fun there. As soon as they leave, Hamlet has his first soliloquy. Now, a reminder then, guys, that soliloquies are extended monologues delivered with the implication that they are the only character on stage. Okay? So these should be a character who is solitary on the stage alone, with nothing else to... And the implication is that it's either in their head or that they're talking to themselves, but the implication always is that with soliloquies is that this is a character's true internal thoughts. This is access into the mind of a character, and we get a rough understanding of who they are, what they are thinking about at that point in time. Hamlet as a play is famous for its soliloquies. Hamlet as a character is famous for his soliloquies. He has 7 soliloquies. I will probably do a more in-depth session on all of the soliloquies together at a later date, but I will do a quick run through of this one now. This is his first one, bearing in mind, and this is his first real one in the play, so it gives us a really interesting introduction to Hamlet. And it starts off on a really negative note. He says, "Oh, that this too sallied flesh would melt, thaw, and resolve itself into a dew." Didn't even need to change the line there. So, sallied is a kind of contested word, and I've put a couple of documents in the teams today about the nature of sallied here. Sometimes it's solid, sometimes it's sullied. Each of those has their own meanings. Sallied to be attacked, sullied to be kind of dirtied or kind of impurified, and solid at the time being a kind of contextual suggestion that your flesh has kind of gone solid due to a kind of excess of melancholic fluids in the body. So that this would actually, he wants his body to melt, thaw, and turn into dew. He wants basically to dissolve. He wants to kind of just melt away. And or if he couldn't do that, he wishes that God, the everlasting, had not fixed his canon. He wishes that God had not made suicide a sin. He wants to die. Hamlet does not want to be alive anymore. He is so sad. And he says, "Oh God, God, how weary, stale, flat, and unprofitable." This lengthy list here of kind of just the bleak qualities of the world. He says, "Seems to me all the uses of this world. The world is rubbish. It's nothing to me." He says, terrible, fie on it. Ugh, I hate it. It's an unweeded garden that grows to seed things rank and gross in nature. So it's just a kind of overgrowing garden with hideous things that kind of possess it merely. Like that Denmark, that the world around him is just this kind of full of monsters and beasts. That it should come to this, but 2 months dead, nay, not so much, not 2, so excellent a king that was to this, Hyperion to a satyr, so loving to my mother that he might not beteem the winds of heaven, visit her face too rough. He says, look, my old dad, he was like Hyperion, and this new king's like a satyr. Satyr, context-wise, Hyperion was a classical god of the sun, the shining beacon of godliness, and a satyr was a drunk man-goat thing who liked to drink wine and sexually assault people. So I think you get the idea there. The old king was lovely, the new king is a beast. And we'll talk about beastliness in the Claudius later on. So he was so loving to my mother, the old king, that he would not even let the winds of heaven visit her face too roughly. And heaven and earth, must I remember, that language kind of continues, why she should hang on him as if increase of appetite had grown by what it fed on. And yet within a month, so like, look, she was so in awe of him, she loved him so much, and yet within a month, and Hamlet's time frame for the remarriage is really fluid in the play, so don't really read too much into this. Sometimes it's a month, sometimes it's 2 weeks, sometimes it's 2 days, hours even. He says, don't let me even think about it. Frailty, thy name is woman. Really important quote there, if you want to look at themes of kind of misogyny in the play, specifically Hamlet's misogyny towards other women and towards his own feminine qualities as he views them. Capitalized women there as well, implying all womankind. He says, a little month, or ever those shoes were old, which she followed my poor father's body. So he's like, look, before the shoes that she used to follow my poor father's body to his funeral, I assume she had new shoes made for her funeral, or maybe a kind of specifically kind of like decorative material for that wedding that they have now deteriorated. Let's have a look in the footnotes here. Yep. The queen's shoes are made of cloth or perhaps very fine leather, as worn by Elizabethan court ladies indoors, and consequently quite fragile. More substantial shoes worn outdoors by ordinary people would not have been considered old after a month or 2 months. Yeah, there you go. So that's pretty much that. So with which she followed my poor father's body, like Niobe. So Niobe is a classical Greek figure. Maybe I'll do a big session on all the classical figures in Hamlet. That might be a good one. Why she, O God, a beast who once with discourse of reason, would have mourned longer, married with my uncle, my father's brother, but no more like my father than I to Hercules. So Hamlet again drops in a classic reference. Look, my uncle is no more like my father than I was to Hercules. I.e., he's much, much, much less. Again, Hamlet here setting up that atypical hero theme. He's not like a Hercules, a big, brutey muscle man. Hamlet is much more of a man of thoughts and feelings and being upset. Within a month, ere yet the salt of most unrighteous tears had left the flushing of her gulled eyes, she married, almost wicked speed. So there's a kind of grotesquerie to the speed of the remarriage, to post with such dexterity to incestuous sheets. So to go with such speed and kind of agility to sheets of incest, Hamlet is the accusation here. It is not, nor it cannot come to good. So again, we've had, like in the first scene where we had the kind of premonition about the ghost, Hamlet believes that this marriage cannot come to good, that there's some kind of doomed quality to this. But break my heart, for I must hold my tongue. So Hamlet feels seemingly more upset about his mother's remarriage than he is about his dad's death. Maybe he's had a little bit of time for that, but he seems mostly to be upset, and perhaps the core source of his upset in the play seems to be his, not only his father's death, but his mother's decision to remarry, and specifically to remarry her brother-in-law. And Hamlet can't speak about this because perhaps this might be treasonous, so he knows that he has to hold his tongue on this issue. And perhaps this is why the king feels that Hamlet's grief for his father is out of place, because it actually turns out that it's not just that, it's actually his grief about this kind of new relationship. We then see Horatio, Marcellus and Bernardo, who we kind of assumed we were maybe going to go transitioning straight away. Now they turn up and they come in and we have a lovely interaction between the two of them, some more split lines, but this time not out of tension, just out of friendliness. You know, Horatio addresses him as his lordship. Hamlet's like, yay, you know, I'm glad to see you well. Horatio, or I do forget myself. He's like, yep, it's me, Horatio, my lord, your poor servant ever. I don't think he's not literally implying that he's his servant here, just to be clear. Just somebody who, you know, likes him. Hamlet decides immediately, says, no, you know, sir, my good friend, I'll change that name with you. Stop calling me my lord. I'm not your lord. He's just, you know, look, I'm your friend. Just call me Hamlet. He says, and what makes you from Wittenberg, Horatio? So he's also come from Wittenberg, and Marcellus is here as well, the guard. My good lord, I'm very glad to see you. To Bernardo, good even, sir. He doesn't seem to know who Bernardo is, which is fine. He's a kind of lower ranked guard, we assume. He's like, but you know, why are you here from Wittenberg? And Horatio's like, look, I've got a truant disposition. I like skiving off. He's like, I don't want to be. I like, you know, wasting my time. I don't want to be doing my education. He's like, I came here for some, you know, to get out of doing work. And he's like, oh, I would not hear your enemies say so, nor shall you do my ear that violence to make it truster of your own report against yourself. So like, no, I won't hear it. You're not a truant. I'm sure you must have had a good reason, you know. Why are you here? Why are you in Elsinore? We'll teach you for to drink before you depart. So look, you know, while you're in Elsinore, you know, my old uni friend, let's have a big drink. You'll learn that before you go. And Horatio's like, look, I came to see your father's funeral. You know, I wanted to see that. And Hamlet's like, don't joke around, Horatio. I think you came to see my mother's wedding. And Horatio's like, yep, they did. They did happen quite close together. And Hamlet doubles down on this joke with thrift Horatio, i.e. that it was done for costing. He says, the funeral baked meats did coldly furnish forth the marriage tables. Would I had ever met a dearer foe in heaven, or ever I have seen that day, Horatio, my father, methinks I see my father. So Hamlet is like, look, you know, they were so close together that the food that they cooked for the funeral was used cold for the marriage itself. And, you know, Hamlet is like, I just, you know, realistically, just kind of, you know, he is kind of, I'm trying to express Hamlet's emotions at this point here realistically, that he would rather have seen, I suppose, you know, I would rather have, I don't know, had like a horrible experience in the afterlife. I would rather have died maybe than experienced that day, than had seen that funeral and then specifically that wedding. He's like, I hate it. And he thinks that he sees his father. And Horatio, obviously, now we know Horatio has seen the ghost. So Horatio was like, oh, where have you seen your father, my lord? And Hamlet's like, oh, in my mind's eye, I think about him, you know, and I have thoughts and feelings about him. But Horatio is like, oh yeah, I've seen him before. He was a goodly king. And Hamlet has a really interesting line here. He says, he was a man, take him for all in all. I shall not look upon his type again. He's like, look, he was just a person. He's a human. I liked him as a human, not necessarily as a king. All the characters talked about old Hamlet in the opening section as this great monarchical figure, this powerful warrior. But Hamlet just views him as his dad, as a man. And Horatio's like, actually, I think I saw him yesterday, last night. And Hamlet's like, saw? No, who? And Horatio's like, yeah, I saw the king, your dad. And he's like, oh, okay, really? Um, to which Horatio kind of, says, seize in your admiration for a while. With an attent ear I may deliver upon the witness of these gentlemen this marvel to you. So he has to kind of do the same patter that the other guys had before. He's like, look, let me just get your imagination ready a little bit, and you get everything up a little bit, because I'm going to have to tell you this story. And Hamlet's like, okay, yeah, let me hear this. I want to hear this. And Horatio's like, 2 nights together, these gentlemen, Marcellus and Bernardo, and we get just a recap, basically, of everything that they've done. They've seen the ghost. There it was. All good. Nothing new there. That's all fine. And Horatio then says, I went with them the 3rd night, and yep, I saw your father. There he was. And we just get some kind of questions, basically kind of fundamentally addressing what happened here. And Horatio just goes through all that we've already seen. None of this is anything new to us. This is just a recap, I suppose, to anybody who wasn't paying attention in the first scene. And they just run through, what he looked like, what he did, what was he wearing. He had his face on, what he looked like. Horatio says that he was more in sorrow than in anger. Hamlet just wants all these specific details. Was he pale or red? Hamlet is just like obsessed with finding out what his father looks like as a ghost, almost suggesting perhaps Hamlet's kind of investment in his dad. And he's like, no, it was very pale. He's like, yeah. Did he look at you? Yeah. I wish I would. I had been there. And he's like, yeah, it would have amazed you. And Hamlet's just kind of delighted. You can see the pace of the scene picks up with the increase in split lines. And as it gets on towards the end, Hamlet's like, maybe, I will watch tonight. Perhaps it will walk again. And Horatio's like, yeah, it probably will do. I bet it will. And Hamlet's like, if it assume my noble person, I'll speak to it, though hell itself should gape and bid me hold my peace. So this is where Hamlet starts to have some doubts. He's been kind of obsessed with it up to here. And then he says, if it takes, again, this language of appearance, if it assumes my noble father's person, I will speak to it, though hell itself should gape and bid me hold my peace. So he worries that this will lead to hell. Now we're going to talk about this in Act 1, Scene 4. Okay, so don't worry about that right now. But Hamlet is dubious about the nature of the ghost. This is all to do with that Catholic Protestant stuff I was talking about previously. And he says, look, I hope you have concealed the sight. Let me be tenable in your silence still. And whatsoever may hap tonight, whatsoever else shall hap tonight, give it an understanding but no tongue. He's like, look, keep quiet on this. I'm really going to need your love for me to do this. I don't want you to tell anyone about anything. He said, so fare you well. Keep yourself onto that platform and I'll see you later. And everyone is like, yep. Our duty to your honour, the 3 of them together. That's a nice. Rarely do you actually get this in the play. You get a couple of characters speaking at once. All 3 characters just go, "We will do that, my lord. We will pledge our duty to your honour." And Hamlet says, "Your loves as mine to you. Farewell." Hamlet constantly focusing on this idea of love and friendship, whereas the others are talking more about duty and honour, which is an interesting kind of double up there. They all leave. Hamlet's left alone. This won't qualify as a soliloquy. This is more of an aside, I would argue. And he says, my father's spirit in arms, all is not well, I doubt some foul play. Would the night were come, till then sit still my soul, foul deeds will rise through all the earth, though all the wealth overwhelm them to men's eyes. She's basically saying here, look, like Horatio said before, something's not right about this. We need, I'm sure some kind of foul and hideous deeds will come out of this. Okay, so that's the first 2 scenes of the play again. Hopefully all of that was useful. Feel free to drop me any questions via email at any time. We've covered hopefully all these things over here. I think it's nice to go through that Hamlet interaction with Horatio there. You really get to see how much Hamlet is a different figure to the others. He doesn't address Horatio in the kind of same deprecatory way as the other figures. He very much is kind of like, he wants to embrace him as an equal. He doesn't want him to do anything for him because he's a prince. He wants people to do things for him because they have affection for him, that they have a kind of desire to help things for him. Okay, so hopefully that's all very useful. And if obviously, if you want, keep churning up for these if you want more of these. I'll be doing another one next Thursday. I'll probably only go through Act 1, Scene 3. Not next Thursday, I keep saying that, the Thursday after the half term. We've got 5 weeks to think of that half term. So we'll do Act 1, Scene 3. We'll do Act 1, Scenes 4 and 5. And then we've got a couple of... and then we've got another... Act 1, Scene 3, 4 and 5. and then we've got Act 3, Scene 1, Act 2, Scene 1, Act 2, Scene 2, and that'll be that. Okay, so that's all good. Please let me know if you have any questions, as I said. Otherwise, have a great weekend. Have a great half term. I will see you after that for a start on the coursework and our first of these. All right, guys. Bye.